Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
Episode 86, Mayday. Negative emotions are contagious. As such, James's moment of hopelessness quickly spread to Vanessa, Katie, and Krista. Seeing their anguish, James realized that, as their leader, he could not display any further negative emotions. No matter how desperate he felt, he had to endure them silently. Otherwise, isolated in the middle of the ocean, they would quickly lose the courage and confidence they needed to survive. He quickly composed himself. "All right, ladies," he said, "there's no giving up now. We still have fresh water, food, and emergency supplies. Our situation isn't hopeless. Regardless of whether we can send out a distress signal, we still have to devise a plan for survival. At the very least, we're still afloat on this boat. We're not treading water, nor do we have to worry about being eaten by sharks, right?" Vanessa put up a brave front. "James is right. With our current supplies, we'll be safe for now." Katie clenched her fist tightly as a flame of hope rekindled her beautiful eyes. "Yeah, James, as long as you remain confident, we will too." Krista's eyes surged with hope. "That's right. We'll live for as long as our supplies last. There's a good chance we'll run into a merchant ship and get rescued." Seeing the sudden change in everyone's moods, James made a prompt decision. "Let's set out all of our water and food. We'll have to keep track of the supplies, formulate a detailed plan, and ration accordingly." It may have been because they had just survived a harrowing pirate hijacking the previous night, but the women rose to the occasion. Each and every action they made was swift, yet efficient, just like experienced soldiers. Seeing their confidence blossom in front of his eyes, James felt both guilty and gratified. He felt guilty because he was not capable of taking care of these beauties by himself. Instead, he had no choice but to have them do work too. On the other hand, he was extremely proud of their determination and strength. Who knew what would happen to them over the ensuing days? He didn't, but he felt much more reassured of their chances for survival. The women gathered all the supplies they had managed to grab last night and spread it out on the deck. There were 150 liters of fresh water, 20 days worth of food, 5 life jackets, 1 first aid kit, 2 smoke bombs, 1 waterproof flashlight, 6 flare signals, 2 axes, 4 fishing rods and tackle, 1 windproof lighter, 1 rain catcher, 1 sailor's knife, 2 nylon ropes, a self-inflating lifeboat, 3 AK-47s, and 3 magazines of ammo with a total of 85 bullets. After seeing what they had, James felt much more confident. If they ate sparingly, collected rainwater, and caught some fish, they should have no problem surviving their current predicament for up to 2 months. Moreover, according to all the Bear Grylls wilderness survival knowledge he had previously obtained, he knew they could very well live for at least 3 to 4 months if nothing unexpected happened. Given that amount of time, James felt that they would either reach land or get rescued at some point. He suddenly burst with optimism. "Ladies," he said, "we will definitely get out of this predicament alive." His timing couldn't have been worse. At that moment, the speedboat suddenly listed to the side. James jolted out of his good mood and checked the condition of the boat in a panic. It didn't take long to find the problem. Another bullet had pierced the back of the hull just under the waterline, allowing seawater to flow into the interior. They were sinking. Not sparing a second, James quickly pulled out the lifeboat and yanked on the self-inflate cord. Puff! An orange lifeboat about 12 feet long and 10 feet wide instantly unfolded on the surface of the ocean. Jumping onto the raft, James shouted at the others, "Pass all the supplies over here. Move!" The speedboat was sinking quickly now, and the supplies on it were the key to their survival. In that moment of desperation, Vanessa, Katie, and Krista remained calm and quickly transferred all the supplies. After they finished, James helped them over to the lifeboat one by one. Once everyone was safely on board, he sat down, panting heavily. He was physically and mentally exhausted. Watching their speedboat sink into the ocean, James, oddly enough, did not fall into a sense of anguish. He knew the boat would have eventually run out of fuel and it could not be paddled as easily as a lifeboat. In fact, doing so would have wasted a lot of their precious strength. After catching his breath, he distributed the first ration of food and water to everyone. Their bodies were starving for nutrients after the stress and exertion of the previous 20 hours. After they devoured their allocated rations, James was struck by a wave of exhaustion. Krista instantly noticed his fatigue. "Get some sleep, James," she said. "Don't worry, I will be on lookout with Vanessa and Katie." Without saying anything else, he nodded his head and fell into a deep sleep. After James fell asleep, Krista assumed command. "Vanessa, Katie, each of you take an oar and row in that direction," she said, pointing in the general direction the speedboat had been heading. She took up position in the rear end of the boat with an AK-47 and remained on high alert for threats from the sea. In this way, they fell into a routine. James would usually sleep during the day and stand guard at night. They set up and administered a reasonable system for rationing food and drinking water. The weather mercifully cooperated as it did not rain even once, and the winds remained calm. In the blink of an eye, more than 10 days at sea had passed. One afternoon, James reflected on their predicament. He felt a great sense of loneliness and boredom being stranded in the middle of the ocean, but at present, the four of them were still in good condition, and as a group, they remained united, which was far beyond his expectations. He even managed to catch quite a lot of fish over the past 10 days, which increased their food supply greatly. Looking at their current situation, he felt much more confident they would make it ashore or be rescued soon. But their smooth sailing was soon to change. That evening, James was suddenly woken up by Krista. The weather had turned dark and gloomy, as if the sky had been covered by an upturned pot. "Sir," she said, "it might start raining soon. We don't have any rain gear on board and the sun shield might not hold up to heavy winds. What should we do?" With extreme weather looming, James looked up at the sky and felt a sense of despair. He had no idea what to do now. Drifting on a lifeboat in the ocean, what he feared most was extreme weather. If it was just heavy rain, he wouldn't be worried. But if it included thunderstorms and raging waves, they would undoubtedly meet their ends right then and there. At that moment, a bolt of lightning flashed through the evening sky, followed by the muffled rumbling of thunder from the thick clouds. Whoosh! In the next instant, pellet-sized raindrops began pouring from the sky. He could barely open his eyes in the deluge. Without time to think, James ripped off his shirt and hurriedly covered up their food supplies. A strong gale suddenly blew across the surface of the ocean, stirring up huge waves that plummeted towards their boat. Their supplies began spilling and rolling everywhere. "Grab the handles at the bottom of the boat," Krista yelled over the tumult. Holding onto the remaining food supply with one hand, James grasped one of the handles tightly with the other. The ladies quickly crouched down and did the same. At that instant, a barrel containing more than 20 liters of fresh water suddenly flew out of the boat and was gone. The lifeboat careened violently in the raging waves. It rode the crests of wave after wave, crashing back down in the troughs with explosive force. As the boat heaved in the wild storm, James felt his body being pummeled by the huge force of the impacts. More barrels of drinking water and other important supplies catapulted into the sea. There was nothing he could do but watch them disappear into the night. A huge crack of lightning suddenly flashed across the sky. As James raised his head and looked up, he felt a suffocating sense of panic like he'd never had before. Episode 87, Tempest. Not far ahead, dense, dark thunderclouds loomed over the ocean. Lightning bolts streaked across the night sky in a crisscross, forming a huge, dazzling web. The constant, deep rumbles of thunder put everyone's nerves on edge. James gritted his teeth and cursed in his heart. What he'd feared most was now happening. Over the 25 days they'd been drifting across the ocean, everything had gone smoothly. Initially, he thought they had a great chance of survival, but now he began cursing God for playing with him. The gales of wind blew increasingly stronger as the rain grew more intense by the second, but the worst was yet to come. An enormous vortex seemed to have formed within the core of the ferocious storm. The waves started surging toward the swirling whirlpool. James realized that their lifeboat was being pulled toward the center of the thunderstorm at an unsettling speed. He knew they had to act fast. Once the boat got dragged into the whirlpool, they would all die. "Quick," he shouted. "Everyone grab an oar and paddle. We can't let the boat get dragged into that." He knew they couldn't just sit here and wait for their death. Even though resistance seemed futile in the face of the raging waves, he did not want to give up even a sliver of hope to survive without trying his best. James no longer cared about the remaining food he'd been trying to prevent from washing overboard. Although the food was crucial for their survival, right now, it didn't matter. Releasing his grip on the food supplies and picking up an oar, he paddled desperately in the opposite direction of the terrifying thunderstorm. Vanessa, Krista, and Katie did the same. But no matter how hard they paddled, they could not escape the grasp of the waves. At best, they were slowing the lifeboat's descent into the heart of the storm. At that moment, the boat was struck by a gigantic wave, hurling them into the air. Katie was instantly launched over the side. She was the only person in their group who did not know how to swim. But even if she did, she would without a doubt drown amid the violent waves. Hearing her scream as she flew out of the lifeboat, James reacted instantly. Tossing the oar aside, he instinctively grabbed onto a handle at the bottom of the boat with one hand and latched onto Katie's calf with the other. Using all his strength, he pulled her back in. Katie collapsed onto the floor of the raft, scared out of her wits. If James had reacted even a second later, she would have been swallowed up in an instant and drowned. "Grab a handle," he shouted. "Lie down on your stomach and don't move." He picked up his oar and continued paddling desperately with all his strength, his arms bulging like coiling dragons. By that time, most of their food, drinking water, and other gear had been washed overboard, but that still was not their first priority. What was most important was simply surviving the night through the ferocious storm. Krista and Vanessa continued pulling on their oars with James, their instinct to survive overpowering their fear of death. Everyone had only one thought in their minds: to survive. Despite their efforts, the lifeboat continued to be dragged towards the thunderstorm. They were simply too weak to compete against Mother Nature's wrath. The closer they were pulled into the core of the storm, the more powerful the wind and waves became. As the lifeboat began to shake violently, they were on the verge of losing control of it. Whoosh! Suddenly, a mountain-sized wave crashed down on their boat from above. Everyone instinctively grabbed a handle below them and flung their bodies to the bottom of the boat. The lifeboat was thrown into the air. Whew! It smashed down heavily onto the ocean surface. Again, it was sent flying into the air by the waves before crashing back down. The shattering impacts made James feel as if his organs were being crushed. At this point, they had lost all control of their boat. As the deafening rumbles of thunder sounded above them, the pounding rain and churning salt water prevented James from opening his eyes at all. Even so, he knew what had happened. They'd been pulled into the very heart of the storm. In the face of the ocean's wrath, James felt utterly helpless. The only thing he could do now was shout out encouragement. "Hold on tight. Hold on to the handles. We will make it out alive." At this point, sheer force of will was their only hope of survival. Who knew how long the intense storm raged? Eventually, the ominous rumbles and heavy rain began to dwindle. As the force of the gales receded, the ocean surface gradually turned serene once again. James was the first to rouse. He opened his eyes weakly, shook his completely numb hands, and raised his head to look around. The three ladies were still there with him, still gripping the handles with all their might. But since they lay there motionless, he could not tell whether they were dead or alive. He called out their names, but still they did not move. Struck by a new wave of anxiety, James struggled to get up and stumble over to shake the closest body to him. Katie let out a heavy groan and slowly opened her eyes. Although she appeared extremely weak, the most important thing was that she was still alive. James next shook Krista and Vanessa. Only after confirming they were alive did he let out an exhausted sigh of relief. With that, he threw his head back and roared like a lion, venting out all of the anger pent up in his heart. Now, James had no choice but to accept the reality of their situation. Though all four of them had survived the storm, their food and fresh water were gone. Their problem now boiled down to a stark calculation. How long could four people survive at sea without supplies before dying of dehydration or starvation? Water! At that moment, Vanessa struggled to get up. She looked at James with pleading eyes. "I'm so thirsty. I need water." Looking at her dry lips and pale face, James could see she was utterly spent. And she wasn't the only one. Krista's and Katie's lips were also parched like cracked earth, and their faces were just as pale. Almost overcome with dizziness, even he felt a ravenous hunger, his body completely depleted of energy. If they failed to replenish their spent calories soon, they could very well fall into a state of hypoglycemia at any time. Looking at the three women staring back at him, James honestly had no idea what to do. Not only were they soaked in sea and rainwater, the cold and hunger had completely extinguished their last hope of survival. James's face went blank. He felt as if they could only wait for their inevitable death. Pulling the three women into his embrace, he could only do his best to warm them and wait for dawn to arrive. But the night air was too cold. Even when they hugged each other tightly, they could not halt the shivering that began to overwhelm their bodies. "Are we going to die?" Vanessa asked in a daze. James spoke through gritted teeth, his tone resolute. "Vanessa, believe me, we will make it out of this alive." In fact, he had lost all confidence in their chances of survival, but he did not want them to feel even more despair. The four of them continued to huddle together in an attempt to stay warm. The minutes ticked by like hours, but in this way they managed to endure the rest of the chilling night. At daybreak, the sun peeked over the eastern horizon and lit the surface of the deep sea. Its promising rays slowly woke them. James propped himself up and looked out at the wide blue sea. He shakily swept his unfocused gaze over their surroundings. That's when he saw it. He couldn't believe his eyes. Right there in the middle of the ocean was a lush green island. James rubbed his eyes and looked again. An island? Am I hallucinating? Krista struggled up from the bottom of the lifeboat and looked out. Jolted by the sight before her, she pointed and exclaimed, "It's an island!" Hearing her words, James felt a surge of relief. It was not an illusion. It was an actual island filled with greenery in the middle of the ocean. Episode 88. Hope on a Sandy Shore. It's an island! The excitement in James's heart was indescribable. They had escaped death again. Vanessa, Katie, and Krista were still very weak after the night's ordeal, but seeing the island reinvigorated their spirits. James rallied the women. "We need to get ashore as soon as possible. The island looks big. We should be able to find food and water there." Everyone leaned on the edge of the lifeboat and started paddling nonstop. The oars had all been lost in the storm, so they could only use their hands to paddle now. After a great deal of effort, the lifeboat finally made it to the shallow waters off the island. James jumped into the water and began pushing the boat ashore. There were no beaches on the coastline from what they could see, only piles of rocks. With that, James carefully pushed the boat to a place where they could disembark. He went ashore first before helping the others. As soon as Vanessa's feet touched solid rock, her legs went soft. She fell to her knees and began crying. Under the protection of her father, she had never experienced any sort of serious suffering, let alone a life-or-death situation. Although she had a fiery personality and put up a courageous front on the outside, her heart was actually rather fragile. When they were drifting in the middle of the ocean, she had been holding back her emotions and did not dare to cry, afraid her fear might spread to everyone else. But now that she was on dry land, all the pent-up stress finally erupted. Katie squatted down to comfort her. "We're alive. We made it," she said. But the abrupt release of tension was too much for her too, and she started crying as well. Even Krista, usually calm and collected, began bawling. All the uncertainty of their days drifting at sea, followed by the tension and terror of the storm, was just too much. James fully understood that they needed to vent the emotions they had been suppressing all these days. He was not the crying type, but he too felt a tremendous release of stress now that they were on solid land. They had all been given a second chance to live. Her tears subsiding, Vanessa looked at James and said with a weak smile, "Please don't think less of me. I really couldn't hold it back any longer." Seeing the women's red and swollen eyes, however, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt. "Vanessa, Katie, Krista, I am so sorry. I wanted to bring you around the world, but to think things would end up this way." Vanessa struggled to her feet and walked to his side. She hugged his arm and said gently, "This had nothing to do with you. Don't blame yourself." "That's right," Katie added. "How could we possibly blame you? It's all those damn pirates' fault, not yours." Standing up, Krista looked at James and said in a serious tone, "Sir, there are countless unknowns and dangers at sea that no one could possibly predict ahead of time. We all knew what we were getting into when we boarded the yacht. It's not your fault. You don't need to blame yourself." She then brought them all back to reality in their immediate predicament. "We are all in urgent need of fresh water and food," Krista said. "We need to start canvassing the island right away." That brought James back to his senses. Krista's right. The most important thing right now is to find food and water. At that moment, he took great comfort in the fact that Krista could always be counted on to keep her head. No matter the situation, she was able to maintain a rational perspective. Whenever he was indecisive or found his own spirit wavering, she would bring him back to reality and move him in the right direction. James composed himself and secured the lifeboat to a rock on shore with a nylon rope. After that, he took stock of what had survived the storm. They only had the second rope, a windproof lighter, an axe, and an AK-47 with 25 rounds of ammo. That was it. They gathered up the remaining supplies and prepared to move deeper into the island's interior. It didn't take long, however, for them to come face to face with a steep cliff. It was more than 30 feet high. Although there seemed to be plenty of handholds for James to climb up with, the women definitely did not have enough strength to do the same. James knew they had to stick together, so he ditched the idea of climbing the cliff and instead led them along a pile of rocks that extended up the shoreline. He hoped they would be able to penetrate the interior from there. The path along the rocks was rough and difficult to navigate. Their thirst, hunger, and lack of energy had taken its toll, slowing their advance along the rocks. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the unrelenting sunlight beat down on them, further aggravating their weak condition. Vanessa was the first to falter. She had fallen into a state of confusion from dehydration and could no longer walk properly on her own. Passing the axe, rope, and rifle he was carrying to Krista and Katie, James hoisted Vanessa onto his back and continued on. This slowed them down even more, but they had no other choice. Carrying Vanessa's dead weight, James noticed his steps getting heavier and heavier by the second. His strength was rapidly diminishing. If things continued at this pace, he would probably collapse long before they found a source of fresh water. It took nearly 2 hours for the group to inch their way along the pile of rocks at the bottom of the cliff. But sure enough, they eventually came to the end of the rocks and emerged onto a silvery white beach on a large bay. Even better, the beach bordered on dense greenery extending into the center of the island. Between the beach and the forested area stood a few tall coconut trees carrying dozens of coconuts. Coconuts! James could not help but shout excitedly. With a sudden burst of strength, he ran towards the beach, still carrying Vanessa on his back. Krista and Katie stood shocked for a moment before joining right behind him. Just as James' feet landed on the soft sand, the system notification, which had not sounded in seemingly forever, suddenly rang out in his mind.